LA City Council authorized a $5 million loan to help pay overtime for LAPD officers working around the clock during recent ICE protests in downtown LA.
It is a dubious distinction for the LA County Sheriff's Department, which is on pace to have a record-breaking year when it comes to overtime spending. Last year, it spent nearly $500 million in OT. Sheriff Robert Luna says this year should exceed that.
Our employees are working more overtime.
So chances are, if you live in a blue city, and especially a blue city in a blue state that embraced the defund the police movement back in 2020, or embraced it due to a local incident that wasn't related to George Floyd, but got some Black Lives Matter attention, a headline like that, where your city or local municipality is borrowing money in order to cover police overtime, is not outside the norm. Now, a lot of people are going to attribute that just to the ICE riots, just to the added force that was needed in order to squelch that in the city of Los Angeles. But make no mistake about it, overtime pay has been a major issue in the city of LA ever since they decided to cut police officers and, of course, funding from the department. In fact, there was a story from the LA County Sheriff's Office from about a month ago of an officer who ended up dying in a car accident, and they actually suspected that the cause of his death was that he was tired behind the wheel of a vehicle, and that ultimately ended up leading to the crash.
Concerns have been raised after Deputy Daniel Chavera died in a car crash. His union says the 21-year-old had just come off a double shift. The cause of the crash is under investigation, and it's unclear if fatigue was a factor. But the sheriff does acknowledge deputies over the last 4 years at the North County Detention Facility, where Chavera worked, averaged about 56 hours of OT a month.
Now again, these are not isolated incidents. These are not a series of one-offs that have no connection to broader policy. What we seem to see every single time that we look at a place that defunded the police is that crime ended up going up. And in response to crime going up, all of a sudden, the city council or whatever local body that controls the police tries to respond by fielding more officers. But the thing is, recruitment is way down, so they end up having to pay through the nose for overtime, essentially trying to stretch their already thin ranks even thinner in order to tamp down the criminality. And this is exactly what is documented in the city of Los Angeles by literal best friend of the channel, Anna Kasparian, in her recent piece about police overtime and how this is directly tied to efforts to defund the police, which ironically doesn't even work in cutting the budgets for these various police departments. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what we're going to break down. But before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay.
Now, this piece is brought to us from Real Clear Investigations. It is written by Anna Kasparian, again, literal best friend of the channel, checked in on me after a dog savagely bit my hand.
It's real, guys. It's real.
Which, by the way, was not a pit bull. Stop asking. Also, I'm okay. Everybody relax. It was traumatic, but I got over it. But this piece actually highlights, again, all these different various officers that are making obscene amounts of money due to the fact that the city of Los Angeles foolishly cut the ranks to the police force, and that of course is being paid out in spades in overtime pay to ridiculous proportions. Now, she starts from the year 2023, which apparently is the last year that we have fully published figures, and she highlights a detective called Detective Rand, who apparently made around $325,000 in a year, nearly doubling his pay due to the fact that he worked significantly more overtime. And again, as Anna Kasparian highlights, this is not a one-off. This is not an isolated incident. This is not an individual just taking advantage of the system. This is the system being crippled by left-wing progressives, and the obvious result of people's backlash against the defund the police movement in wanting more officers out on the streets end up resulting in higher overtime because they just don't have the ranks. Now, the nearly $325,000 salary, according to OpenGovPay.com, easily topped the $224,000 that Governor Gavin Newsom makes and the $301,000 that Mayor Karen Bass makes. And Rand's case, as Anna says, is not unique. In 2024, the department spent an all-time high of $265 million in overtime alone, which is an increase of $100 million for that line item in the city's budget since 2019. Now, she also points out that before that year, no LAPD officer had ever earned more than $235,000 in in overtime pay. However, in 2024, 7 officers did, including Detective Nathan Curie, whose combined compensation of $603,887 made him the highest paid cop in the city of Los Angeles, according to a report by openbooks.com. All told, nearly 3 dozen LAPD officers made at least $400,000 in overall pay for the year. Now, I don't know if you guys remember what the LA City Council decided to cut from the Los Angeles Police Department all the way back when in the year 2020, right before their rampant crime spike, specifically in homicides, but it was about $145 million that they wanted to remove from the budget in order to flood into the social workers, because really we didn't need to send all these armed officers to these violent crime scenes because social workers were going to save the day. But again, as you can see by the numbers, what they're paying out in overtime each and every year since that horrific error, what's ultimately the consequence is not only do you fund programs that absolutely don't work and are an absolute mess, but in addition to that, you end up paying more money for police. And again, if these were the top cops, the absolute best of the best that were earning over $400,000 a year, I might grimace at that number, but the results could prove to be worth it. But the fact is, you would do significantly better hiring more officers in order to handle the increased workload rather than just paying so many people so much overtime. And again, not factored into this particular article is what I told you earlier on about the LA Sheriff's Department, which is on pace for an insane $500 million in overtime pay for that particular department. And again, this is because of the defund the police policies backfiring in every possible way. Remember, they promised us crime would go down, the cities would be safer, police violence would reduce, and again, think of all the savings that we were going to get because we were just wasting money funneling it into law enforcement. And it turns out they were wrong in every regard. It turns out you're even spending more money, so even cutting the money to the police doesn't actually reduce funding to the police. Now, Anna attributes the spike to 3 main factors. 1, a shortage of cops. 2, the city council's continued embrace of the defund the police movement. And of course, general fiscal pressures. However, cutting the force is costing the city more, not less, while hindering the LAPD's ability to respond to calls for help. Now, this isn't mentioned in this particular article because this is about the city of Los Angeles and the LAPD in particular, but if you guys will remember, I recently covered in the city of Oakland that a new study came out that showed that the loss of tax revenue due to the increase in crime, due to the fact that the Oakland City Council cut back on the Oakland PD, was actually one of the main driving factors in the budget deficit that is crippling the city economically. So it turns out one of the things that I've been telling you on this channel for years is absolutely true, which is crime drives poverty, not the other way around, is not only proving itself to be fact in the city of Oakland, but in the city of Los Angeles, we are seeing similar results as business receipts end up going down in downtown Los Angeles due to the fact that people don't want to be there, due to the fact that crime is up, due to the fact that there are less police and longer police response times. All of these factors are combining in order to create a death spiral for the city of Los Angeles, but unfortunately, they have enough members of their city council that are still wedded to the idea of defunding the police that it doesn't look like they're going to reverse course. But again, logic and reason ends up prevailing to some extent when they realize that they need to field these officers for overtime. So it still, of course, costs the city more money when in reality, what they need to do is go on a hiring binge to bolster the ranks of the LAPD. And again, we can look at the numbers so we can understand how bad it's actually gotten. So in 2020, there were 14,902 LAPD employees. This includes both sworn officers and civilian staff, and this made for a budget of $1.71 billion. 4 years later, the department shrank to 12,617 employees. However, the cost is $1.73 billion. That increase is due in large part to costly overtime pay in order to cover the shortage of sworn officers. But despite despite thinner ranks and a thicker payroll, local policymakers have opted for further cuts to the department's manpower, which would drive up overtime pay even more. So again, by the numbers, they ended up shedding about 2,500 staffers from the Los Angeles Police Department. Again, sworn officers and of course civilian employees. However, their budget went up, not down, as a response to that. You're spending more money for significantly less people on your police force, and it's absolutely disastrous because you're seeing the results on the streets of the city of Los Angeles with the elevated crime levels that are above the pre-George Floyd levels. So again, this policy has not worked in any regard, and of course, many people in the LA City Council, these same woke representatives that ran on and won on defund and some of them abolished the police platforms, are doubling down on their desire not to hire more officers. Now, a recent report by openbooks.com found that it's not just police officers who are being asked to do more. Quote, the top paid lifeguard in LA County was compensated more than $500,000 in 2024, and over the past 5 years, a single lifeguard was able to pull down $702,000 in overtime alone, the report said. Los Angeles has spent $1.1 billion on overtime pay for public workers across city departments in 2024, a figure higher than the city's nearly $1 billion budget deficit. Los Angeles is just one of the major cities struggling to provide basic services in the face of declining revenues stemming from shuttered downtown businesses, loss of federal funds, and sharply rising pension payments, among other reasons. So again, this is nearly an identical scenario to what we saw in the city of Oakland. You end up cutting your police department due to the fact that you believe they're filled with evil white racism. Everybody watch out for the evil white racist police.
Like, oh, so you said that it was a white guy. What happened?
And then what ultimately ends up happening? Crime goes up. Thefts go up, businesses get put out of business, tax receipts end up going down, and as a response to that, you end up with a budget deficit. So you start making cuts. You cut other public positions, and again, they have to be compensated more with the remaining staff making overtime, and of course, they go to the police because it's a large portion of the city's budget, and they make even more cuts against the department. And again, then you have more crime, you have less tax revenue, then of course, you have a bigger budget deficit, and essentially you set yourself up for failure. You created a death spiral that could have been avoided had you not embraced these ridiculous policies. And again, this isn't speculation, this isn't theory, this is something that people used to acknowledge in this country, and now they're starting to acknowledge it again. Again, see my video on the city of Oakland, realizing that a huge portion of their budget deficit is attributed to the crime as a result of them cutting their police, and you realize that there's almost no way out of this except for temporarily cutting other government services, bolstering your police ranks, and hoping that businesses return so that you have more revenue to spend on your pet projects. Now, Anna continues, the recent riots in Los Angeles and President Trump's
Simply hearing Trump over and over again.
decision to send 4,800 U.S. Marines and members of California's National Guard to the city have focused attention on its shrinking law enforcement capabilities. The LAPD, which was staffed with around 10,000 sworn officers at the start of 2020, argues that that is the minimum number of cops it needs to respond to 911 calls and address public safety concerns. But LAPD brass anticipates that they will lose more than 150 additional officers over the next year, shrinking the force to around 8,620 by June 30 of 2026. Making matters worse for the department, the city council's May 2025 vote in favor of additional LAPD cuts will leave the agency with just 8,400 cops, the lowest number since 1995. That will continue a long-term trend. Now, Anna also points out that the LAPD's per capita numbers, which by the way, in this section of the article, she forgets to say that she's counting the number of officers per 100,000 people, is significantly lower than other notable departments like the DC Metro Police, which has about 543 officers per 100,000 compared to the LAPD's 240-ish officers per 100,000, which is almost half the size compared to their population as their DC counterpart. Now look, I will link this entire article in the description of this video so you can get a detailed breakdown of the numbers. Hopefully they make the correction to make it clear that they mean per 100,000 for those officer numbers. But one of my favorite parts about this particular article is when Anna talks about one of the programs that they diverted funding away from the LAPD from, which of course is a program to send unarmed teams of individuals to areas in order to deal with the mentally distressed or cases that allegedly don't require an armed officer in order to deal with. And one of the hilarious things about this is that not only is this program that they're adding $14 million more to not proven to be effective at all whatsoever, but it turns out when these unarmed teams of individuals go out and confront the mentally ill, because they're trained to deal with those people, they know how to handle those situations much better than law enforcement. Oftentimes the result is they just end up calling the police. So again, you're not only paying for these social workers that are supposed to replace the police, but these social workers end up calling the police just to deal with this situation. So instead of sending one squad car, which will typically have 2 officers in it, you end up sending a team of 5 social workers who just call the police, and then the 2 officers show up anyway in order to deal with the situation, because spoiler alert, these situations with mentally distressed people that you don't need an armed officer for oftentimes spiral completely out of control, and if civilians could handle them on their own, they wouldn't have called for help in the first place. Now, Anna also highlights a bunch of city council members that are absolutely terrible on this issue. You have Isabel Jurado, who responded to the campaign question about public safety by saying F the police. Jurado's campaign was backed by other members of the city council like Nitha Raman, Eunices Hernandez, and Hugo Soto Martinez, who all won seats with their calls to defund the police. Now, you guys might remember we actually covered Soto Martinez on this channel before because he was one of the major proponents on the $30 wage increase for hotel employees that has resulted in the cancellation of certain renovation projects and expansions in hotels in the city of Los Angeles that, of course, will not only cost employees their jobs, but will cost the city of Los Angeles more money. So it's nice to know that Soto Martinez is terrible on every issue, not just a few issues. Now, Councilwoman Rahman, who is also named in this list of terrible representatives by Anna Kasparian, is also somebody who's notable during the spike in catalytic converter thefts that we saw a couple of years ago in the city of Los Angeles and across the country, for saying that it's not the fault of them not having police officers, even though they were solving these cases at comically low rates. In reality, it's the fault of the auto manufacturers for making catalytic converters so easy to steal. So in reality, what we needed to do was not only arrest poverty, but arrest General Motors and Toyota as well, because apparently the catalytic converters were being stolen not due to lax law enforcement, but due to the fact that these innocent Baba Angel Aladdins couldn't resist because it was too easy to steal. Now, like I said earlier, you can read the full article in the link in the description. I actually think it is a very important piece because it shows the failure of defund the police on multiple different levels. But the thing is, this is an elitist belief, often described as a luxury belief. Again, I played this clip from this guy giving a speech on luxury beliefs where he outlines who is supportive of these programs, and it turns out it is people who make over $100,000 a year and the people who are the least likely to be impacted by a shortage of law enforcement, because it turns out the minority high crime areas have a lot of minorities that are being victimized by crimes, and this is why they show up time and time again in polling as being opposed to defunding the police.
So what is an example of a luxury belief? Well, in 2020, the defunded the police movement gained a lot of momentum, and in early 2021, YouGov ran a survey and found that overall, Americans were very much against defunding the police. But when they broke down the results by income category, they found that the highest income Americans were by far the most supportive of defunding the police. There was another survey of just Democratic voters and found that white Democrats were far more supportive of defunding the police than Black and Hispanic Democrats. And so as a result, despite the fact that most people didn't want this, many cities across the US subsequently reduced spending for police departments. And this has contributed to the violent crime wave that we've seen over the last couple of years.
Now, with all that being said, I want to know what your thoughts are on the consequences and the fallout of defund the police down in the comments below. Also, I will remind you to wish Anna Kasparian a happy belated birthday. It passed by a couple of days ago, so I think that would be nice. Also, she brought us this great article for me to make this video, so I do appreciate it. But as per usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social medias. You can support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Anna Kasparian destroying defund the police. Till next time.